in the New Testament where some manuscripts include a text and others do not, and trying to do somewhat of a deep dive into that subject. I think Daniel was wise to start off each class by making a few remarks and clarifications, because I think he hit the nail on the head. There's a lot of potential to come away with misunderstandings, or to come away with the idea that maybe we're saying the Bible's not trustworthy, and that's certainly not what we want to do. So before we dive into our text tonight, first of all, the New Testament has better and earlier support than the text of any other work from ancient literature, bar none. If we can't know what the New Testament says, we need to be skeptical of any other ancient work by about 100-fold, is what the math works out to if we had time to unpack that. It's inevitable that when long documents are copied by hand, those manuscripts are going to contain differences. If each of us took just the book of 1 John, fairly short, and we each copied it, we would wind up with some interesting variations there. And just as would be the case with us, when the New Testament was copied, many of those errors were innocent. Most of them are easily correctable. If we were copying the preamble to the Constitution and we put, in order to form a more perfect onion, you would know immediately it was supposed to be union. Those sorts of mistakes. The vast majority of them can't be translated in English, don't change the meaning of the text, but we are studying some that do alter the meaning of the text, or in fact alter what the text is. And so that's what we're studying in this class. That branch of Bible study is called textual criticism. Even though the word criticism is there, it's a good and a necessary study. It's how we establish what the actual text of the Bible is. What did the New Testament authors write? So some preliminary remarks continuing before we dive in. The data that we're going to talk about tonight comes from a book that's actually in the church library. It's the United Bible Society's copy of the Greek New Testament, and even though it is a Greek Bible, there is a section, you probably won't be able to see it from back there, but at the bottom of each page that lists some of these differences when the manuscripts differ, and it lists what the evidence is for each reading. There's a separate table you can go and look at, but it's going to walk through what the evidence is on each side. It's going to walk through the dates. You are going to have to do some flipping back and forth to see what all the different symbols mean, but that's largely what we're going to be looking at this evening. So let's get into it. First of all, the majority of all Greek manuscripts are very clearly going to fall on the side of including this passage. There is a symbol anytime you're going through here, BYZ. If you find that, the majority of manuscripts are going to include that. However, it is going to specify from the second millennium on. That's an issue that's going to come up on most of the passages that Daniel has been discussing, several others that I don't know if are going to be covered in this class. We have a lot of late stuff. We have a little early stuff, and often the decision comes down to which of those are you going to go with. But if you simply want to know, do most New Testament manuscripts include the narrative of the woman taken in adultery, the answer is going to be yes, they do. A lot of them are going to be late. I believe the number is somewhere around over 900 manuscripts actually include this. But again, they are late. So let's talk about the papyri. These are the early manuscripts. These are, in fact, the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament that we have. There are actually only two that even include this section of John. Neither of them include this passage. So if we want to know the question, what do the most manuscripts say? They're going to opt for inclusion. If we ask, what do the earliest say? The two earliest witnesses do not include this passage, and we'll talk about that a little bit further. Daniel has mentioned the uncials. These are the manuscripts that are in all capital letters, no spaces, no periods, no punctuation. The papyri were that way too, but these are written on more parchment or vellum. The earliest manuscript that's going to contain this passage is what's called D. It's from the 6th century. It's also called Codex Bezae. It's kind of an odd duck. It's actually a very odd duck, and we need to talk about this a little bit before we move on. The scribe who produced D had a tendency to add details that did not belong. If there was a narrative and it mentioned maybe a centurion, he's going to tell you what the centurion's name is. If you want an idea of how many details he added, the book of Acts is 10% longer in this document. So Acts has 28 chapters. That's almost 3 additional chapters worth of content in this manuscript, and it's the very first time we find this passage. Philip Comfort is one of the foremost experts on the New Testament. Papyri specifically is his area of expertise. He said quite specifically it's characteristic for the scribe of this manuscript to have added the words, "and each went to his own home" in John 7:53. And the reason he said this is because this scribe made an almost identical addition at the end of Acts 5:18. So this is the earliest manuscript that includes this passage, and there's some extra things that kind of go with that. If we look outside of manuscript D for some of these uncials, we have to jump all the way to the 9th century. So we have one highly suspect manuscript in the 6th century. We've got to go all the way to the 9th century before there is any Greek text that has this in it. Moving forward in time, we then have the minuscules. These are the documents that are written more in cursive. They're written in lowercase Greek. These are going to have the punctuation in them. This is that majority of the manuscripts is what they are. They're the minuscules. They come much later. Most textual critics, most scholars that look at this stuff don't give them nearly as much weight. Here are a few of the ones that are cited by the UBS editors. Again, there's about 900 of them or so. But starting around the 9th century. Then we have lectionaries. These are the copies of the text that were written to be read during worship. There are lectionaries that contain this passage, but we're going to hold off on discussing them. There's some extra things that go with that. They're actually going to fall into a different category of evidence. So put a pin there, we will come back to it. Early translations. This is the Greek New Testament being translated into various languages as the gospel spread out. The earliest one that's going to include this passage is the Vulgate, which is interesting. It's dated 4th, 5th century. We actually have this passage in Latin before we have it anywhere in Greek. It's also found in the Old Latin. It's in the Palestinian Syriac, some of the Coptic Bohairic, some Old Church Slavonic. That's obviously a lot later, but if we're looking at the first translation, it is the Vulgate. 4th, 5th century is generally where that's going to be dated. Let's talk about patristic testimony. These are writings from outside the New Testament. These are sometimes called the Church Fathers. Let me say a few things about those writings before we actually look at the evidence here. So as Daniel pointed out, I believe, well, he wasn't here last week, the week before last, he said absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and he's exactly right. Just because a writer never cited or quoted a passage does not mean that writer was not aware of the passage. So we can't just go, well, these guys, seem to quote it, these guys didn't, so these guys were aware of it and these weren't. That's not good logic. Let me throw out the corollary, though, that may make you raise your eyebrow a little bit, and then let's talk about it. Evidence of presence is not presence of evidence. What in the world does that mean? The question is not, did some of these early writers know of this story or this narrative? The question is, did these early writers know of it as scripture? And that's an important distinction. It was important enough to John in his own gospel that in both John 20 and John 21, he specifically paused to say, you know what, there's a lot of other things that Jesus said, there's a lot of other things that Jesus did, and you know what, they're not included in here. The things that are written that you might believe. So there are other accounts of things that Jesus did, there are other accounts of things that Jesus said that are not in the Gospels. Some of them are later in the New Testament, but there was a lot of oral tradition that circulated. And so the question is not, was someone familiar with this story, but when they were familiar with it, did they understand that it was supposed to be part of Scripture? Did they understand that it was, whether it was something John wrote under inspiration from the Holy Spirit? Those are two very different questions. So as you're going through these kinds of studies or reading commentaries, it makes a difference whether we can find that or not, because someone may be familiar with it, but it was just something they heard. So as we go through this part, the dates you're going to see are generally the dates where these individuals died, as best we know. We often don't know what year they published a work or they wrote something, but if we know roughly when they died, that kind of puts a cap on it. So for the Greek fathers, there's two writings that are cited. Both of them are 4th century, late 4th century, kind of almost getting into 5th. If we look at the Latin fathers, and we're not going to go through all this list, we've got the 4th century, again, is about the earliest that this passage comes up. Again, we're not going to go into all that detail, but just the 4th century, really. So the question is, if it was originally there, if it was in these manuscripts, if these people knew about it, why was it removed? The typical suggestion that's made is simply, well, Jesus was soft on adultery. He was given permission to sin, and we can't have that, so we need to cut this passage out of the Bible. We actually find that as early as Augustine. There's an interesting quote where he talks about that this passage, some people cut it out of their Bible because it gave liberty to sin with impunity was granted to their wives. And take that for what it's worth, but that was his take on it. That seems to be really the only explanation that you see today when you dig into this. And that's an important point when we're looking at differences in the manuscripts, especially should a passage be there or not. If it was originally there, why would it have been removed? If it wasn't originally there, why would it have been added? So that's the answer that's given to, if it was there, why did it disappear? Why did it stop being there? Okay, so that was the overview of the evidence for including it. Let's look at the evidence for excluding the passage. What are some reasons that some Bibles don't include this or relegate it to footnotes? Okay, so again, let's go back to the earliest manuscripts. Let's look at the New Testament papyri. We said there's only two that include it. It's P66 is dated to about the year 200, which is much, much earlier than any of the evidence we looked at for including it. The earliest manuscript of this passage we have does not include this passage. Next is P73, which is dated to the early 3rd century. Those are the main two witnesses. Again, I'm going to cite Philip Comfort, who is one of the foremost experts in this field. He'd argue that another document called P39, Papyrus 39, which is also 3rd century, did not contain the passage. This particular manuscript, it's only one page front and back, but there's two very important things about this manuscript. Number one, the scribe that wrote it had a page number on it, on both sides. He numbered the pages as he was writing John. Number two, he's extremely uniform in his lines, his lettering, his text. And so when you have those two things, you can kind of work backwards. If this is the rate and this is the amount of text that fits on each page, and there's X number of pages, even though we just have this one page, would there have been enough room for this passage? And by his math, by his measurements, he said, no, it doesn't fit. So you can say there's two papyri that didn't have it. You can add the third, but again, these are very early witnesses, earlier than anything that does include it. We then look at the uncials, again, the vellum, the parchment, all capitals. We had D for the 6th century for inclusion. We can go back to the 4th century for exclusion. And that's going to have Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, the two that are often cited when you do these sorts of studies. You'll notice there's some there that say probably. That's the same sort of thing with the papyrus we looked at. There's some kind of gap, there's some kind of issue. but using the measurements, looking at it, working backwards, we don't think they included it. So again, that evidence goes back to the 4th century. Minuscules, again, the largest category. Even though most of them do include it, there's a good sampling of those that don't include John 7:53 through 8:11. Again, starting around the 9th century is when those became popular. They went on after that. Most of them do have it, not all. So, lectionaries. When the UBS editors kind of pick what evidence to cite, they look at what's the most relevant, what's the most important witnesses, and kind of sift through that. They just lump a lot of the lectionaries together with this symbol LECT. They put that on the side of what they consider the best, the most reliable, do not include the passage. And again, those documents start around the 9th century is what we're looking at. We look at early translations for this passage. We can go back to the 4th century, both for the Old Latin, for the Syriac, for the Coptic. There's more languages that go back to the 4th century, whereas for inclusion, if you'll remember, we had the Vulgate that was kind of right on that cusp of 4th, 5th century. So when we look at other translations, the earlier ones do not include this passage. When we get to patristic testimony, the early church fathers or early writers, you'll notice there's a 2nd century on there, Tatian's Diatessaron. You may have been familiar with McGarvey's Fourfold Gospel. That's also one we have in the church library. He took Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and kind of combined it into one long-running narrative. He actually got the idea from Tatian, did that back in the 2nd century, and Tatian did not include that passage in his work. So that's going to be the earliest we can go in the church fathers or patristic writings is the 2nd century. There's some of the Latin fathers. You'll notice Tertullian is pretty early. He did not include that text. So the pattern you're seeing here as we go down these categories is most of them, the evidence not to include it in almost every category is stronger than the evidence for including it and is earlier than the evidence for including it. But then we've got this category other, and there's two things we need to look at for that. The first is the idea of asterisks or obeli. These are marks that scribes would make when they are copying manuscripts to kind of signify something's not right with this passage. Something, maybe this passage doesn't belong, it should be viewed with suspicion, that sort of thing. There's a lot of manuscripts that scribes did that with this passage. It is the case with the uncials, it is the case with the minuscules, and it is the case with the lectionaries. So I said we were going to come back to the lectionaries for inclusion because there's some things we needed to say about them. The only lectionaries that the UBS editors cite that do include this passage are marked up by scribes. They have these marks, some of them going back to the 10th century is about when they start. I think I have 9th up there, that just mental note, that should be 10th. But as the scribes were copying these, they maybe had one manuscript that included it, but they had others that didn't, so they marked it, maybe as a question mark. When we look at all the other things with the evidence, and then we look at the number of manuscripts that scribes marked these up with, that is unusual and does raise some questions about whether it was original or not. But to me, this is the one that's even more interesting. This passage floats around. If you look at different manuscripts, it appears in different places. It's not consistent. There is a family of manuscripts called F13 or Family 13. About 13 different manuscripts are included in that from the 11th to 15th century. In all of those manuscripts, this passage occurs after Luke 21:38. You have Luke 21:38 And then you have this story of the woman taken in adultery. You have a minuscule from the 11th century that includes John 8, 3-11, right after Luke 24:53. You have another one from the 12th century that includes it after John 7:36. And then there are a whole long list of manuscripts, including some Armenian ones that put it at the very end of John. And then there's several Georgian manuscripts that include it after 7:14 in John. So what do we do with that? Well, manuscripts were very expensive to make. The material, the animal skins, the process to prepare that, they were expensive in terms of having a scribe be able to do that. Not everyone was able to afford their own personal copy of the New Testament. These were very precious things. You didn't waste anything. And so if a scribe skipped a line or skipped a passage, they would put it kind of in the margin, and then the next scribe coming around copying it would go, oh, this is in the margin, it belongs in the text, and they put it back in there. The problem is other things were also put in the margin. For example, a centurion is mentioned. Let's just go back to that example. And in your area, maybe that's where the centurion was from, and hey, his name's Bob, so I'm going to put Bob in the margin. And then the next scribe comes around, maybe 100 years later, you're dead, he can't ask you, he just looks at this manuscript, oh, Bob's in the margin, they must have forgot that, so I'm going to stick it in the text. And then things wind up there. A lot of scholars are going to take the position that's kind of what happened here. There was perhaps this story circulating, this oral tradition, and people wrote it in the margin of manuscripts because it seemed like it went here or there, and then it worked its way into the main body of the text after these passages. This is not the only passage when we look at the New Testament that we see appear in different places, but almost always when we do see that occur, it's a red flag that there's some question about whether it was originally written by a New Testament author. If this passage originally was written by John and it belongs right after John 7:52, it's hard to answer why it would appear in all these other places. I've not heard a good explanation for that, but that's a question that does get asked. So to me, that's one of the more interesting things about this passage is it does pop up in places that we don't necessarily expect, almost as if scribes were looking for, well, where does it fit? So the verdict of the versions, what have English Bibles done with this text? King James Version 1611, obviously it includes it in the main text, no brackets, no footnotes, no nothing. American Standard Version 1901, same thing. You won't find it in no brackets, footnotes, it's just there. The Revised Standard came out originally in 1971, and the very first printing did not include it in the main text, it included it in the footnote. Well, the outcry against that was so great that at the second printing, guess where it went? Right back in the main text. The New Revised Standard Version came out in 1989. If you'll look in that Bible, you'll see it's in double brackets, and if you look at the preface to that, the editor said that those are used to enclose a few passages that are generally regarded to be later additions to the text, but which we've retained because of the evident antiquity and their importance in the textual tradition. So in other words, they said it's very old, it's very important, we didn't want to get rid of it. We also have questions about whether it actually belonged. And then they have a footnote, the most ancient authorities lack it, other authorities add it here, or after some of the other passages, some mark it as doubtful. We get to the New King James Version, 1982. It includes it with no brackets, no segregating markers. And then they have a footnote, NU, that's the Nestle Aland text and the UBS text. It's the same thing. This is the text that underlies, I cannot get my words out tonight, most English Bibles. That text, it says, it's marked as not original, but it is present in over 900 manuscripts. NIV, New International Version, came out in 1984, includes the verses between two black bars that section it off from the surrounding text. It has a footnote: the earliest manuscripts and other witnesses do not have John 7:53 through 8:11. They revised the NIV in 2011, and they did fix some of the problems that were present in the original. I think there's still a lot of problems left, but Daniel's already covered that, so we won't go back over it. The 2011 revision of the NIV does still have it kind of sectioned off, and it has an in-text note, not a footnote, not something at the bottom of the page, an in-text note saying that the earliest manuscripts and many other ancient witnesses don't have it. A few manuscripts include the verses wholly in part after, and then it lists some of the different locations that this text pops up. English Standard, I didn't go back and look at when the ESV first came out. It's been revised several times since. I think the most recent revision was 2016. It is in double brackets if you use the ESV. They do have an in-text note about the earliest manuscripts don't include it, and then they have a footnote about it. The Christian Standard Bible isn't one we talk about a whole lot. Daniel's mentioned it in this class, and I think had it kind of on the scale of literal to dynamic equivalence that he had up there, or just kind of education level for the reading, 5th grade, 11th grade, whatever. But for what it's worth, that translation does put it in brackets. It's got an in-text note and a footnote. New American Standard 2020 does have it in double brackets and has a footnote. And that was the bell. So we will go ahead and I've talked at a pretty quick pace. Any questions or comments in the few minutes we've got left? I know a lot of the material Daniel's been covering is more technical in nature.
Could I ask your personal opinion?
Sure.
What do you think?
For this particular one, I fall on the side of there's so much evidence against it. I have trouble explaining why it's missing in all these earlier ones, but to me, kind of the linchpin is they couldn't figure out where to put it, and it moved around until it kind of got settled. But also the fact that it first appears in a Greek manuscript in D is also really interesting. Most of the scholars, and we don't have time to go through, I've got a couple quotes on here, they're going to fall on the side of this is a story that did happen, it's not fiction. It was so widespread, it was so valued that it eventually made its way in, but they're going to say it did happen, just John did not write it originally. It wasn't in the earliest manuscripts. And there's people that are going to disagree. Yeah.
Could you sort of further explain why he said Augustine sort of took it out of certain versions?
Yes. So
you said he was Jesus was soft on adultery, and that's what his thinking was, something like that.
Yeah. So Augustine did not personally remove it. That was one of the quotes I actually did look up. He said that some people, because they viewed this passage as giving their wives license to sin, removed it because they wanted their women to be faithful to them.
I got you.
So that was his comment, and that still is the prevalent theory for if it was original, why did it fall out? Yeah.
Is it possible that one of the reasons that it seems like scholars are sort of reluctant just to excise it completely? Could it be that might be the reason? One of the reasons is that it's just become such a popular story, not even just in the religious world, but in the world as a whole.
Absolutely.
Again, like he used without sin cast the first stone, that might be a reason why they're so reluctant
Absolutely.
to take it out.
Look at the people on the far right and the far left of this issue. All of them will agree that this is an authentic narrative. This is something that happened. This is something that Jesus said and did. No one really questions that. None of the serious scholars do. And that's why even the English Bibles that Daniel's been talking about that don't include this passage, it is given such a high regard. That, none of them just, it disappears with no explanation. All of them go, hey, even if we don't think this is in the main text, it's important and we want you to know about it. Other questions? So again, a lot of these are going to come down to the question of, do you put the value on the majority of the manuscripts or a few earlier ones? This particular passage, though, just about every category, we have earlier evidence for the passage not being there. The argument that the people who put the most weight right here on just the majority, the argument here is, these are the manuscripts that we have the most of. These are the manuscripts God preserved. These are the manuscripts the church has used throughout history, and therefore, in God's providence, he preserved the correct text. That is essentially going to be the argument used for that. I think we can argue that God preserved his text either way. I don't think that necessarily needs to be a part of it. But these are the 20 passages. If this sort of thing interests you, if you go through the text of what's used for most English Bibles, if you look at the footnotes, these are the passages. If you have a King James or New King James, they're going to follow this majority here. All of these passages are in the King James. All of them are in the New King James. If you use a more modern translation that's going to be based on this, if you use the ESV, if you use the New American Standard, Christian Standard, these are the passages you're going to want to look at the footnotes for, or consult some commentaries, or do a little bit more deep dive. The ones in red are what we've covered in this class so far, so we've done 4 out of 20. There are others we could look at. Most people either love this sort of study or hate it. I obviously love it. I like getting into the details. Most people just give me the shorter footnote. So I hope I didn't confuse you. I hope I added some clarity to this. I'm happy to stay and answer any additional questions you have, but that was the second bell, I believe. So thank you for being here.